So the topic today, we thought we'd run and do these quite regularly actually as just short, quick webinars where we can access and update our knowledge and evidence-based research around some of these topics that are really affecting business everywhere. So these topics today, the first panel, of course, will be on new developments in greenwashing, and the second will be around the regulations and enforcement of defence export controls, both of which are affecting business across the economy. So really looking forward to the discussion, and I do encourage you to use the chat as well as we go through the webinar. And Shannon Covell, one of our trust ethics and governance academics who helps to lead this group, will be assisting with some of that Q&A, as well as Rada Ivory, who's online as well. So firstly, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of Meanjin, on which I'm certainly from which I'm speaking today. And particularly not only their ancestors, but their emerging leaders as we walk with them in reconciliation. And I'd like to acknowledge particularly our academics and students in the Trust Ethics and Governance Alliance, who we really value as members, and particularly for their unique perspectives around ethics, inclusion and governance in the Australian society. Just some details too about how to find us. We have a LinkedIn group, so I'd encourage you to please join up. We'd love to hear from you. Our mission is very much to marry the scholarly aspects that certainly we bring, evidence-based research, with the practicality and policy side through our partners in government and industry, not-for-profit sectors. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's stellar speakers. We have experts from both academia and externally from industries. We're really grateful to you all for joining us today and looking forward to hearing from you. Now the bios, I probably can't do them justice in the time. And of course, you've seen those bios as part of the registration process, but very briefly, I'll summarise. We have Ilona Miller, who is a partner at Gilbert and Tobin Banking and Project Group. She specialises in global climate change, extensive experience over 20 years on climate law and finance, including the development of law and policy and its implementation by both governments and the private sector. Ilona's particular focus is on advising on the legal aspects of international and domestic climate change policy, carbon markets and emissions trading. And she's worked extensively on the development of carbon contracts, carbon funds, carbon transactions in both the compliance and voluntary markets. And of course, as we all wrestle and are challenged in our ESG strategies, Ilona actually specialises in advisory and legals around that space as well. Professor Kathleen Hairbon is one of my colleagues at the University of Queensland and a member of the Trust Ethics and Governance Alliance. She's a professor in financial accounting at the UQ Business School. And Kathleen's research is concerned with corporate social responsibility for issues in climate change and tax transparency, with a focus on how public data can be used in debt and equity markets to inform stakeholders about organisational performance. Kath has, provides a really unique perspective actually, but a really important one that I know I've certainly seen in the business space that is increasingly important, about how to actually be aware and report and discern the greenwashing problem through accounting practices. Barbara Jedlikova is also online. Barbara is a senior lecturer, another one of our colleagues here at the University of Queensland, a senior lecturer in the UQ Law School with a specialty in competition law. Barbara's principal research interests are competition law theories, competition law in the digital economy, and comparative competition law. Her research has focused on many topics, including cartels, vertical restraints, bargaining power, and economic and jurisprudential theories and arguments in competition law. So she'll be able to give us once again, a unique perspective on the contextualization of greenwashing and enforcement actions around it. We also have Lauren Sanders. Lauren is a senior research fellow at the UQ Law School on the Law and Future of War project. She is a former Defence Force lawyer, and her research focuses on defence export controls, the arms trade and sanctions regimes concerning trust military systems and associated technologies. Lauren has spent 20 years as an Australian Army signals officer and legal officer, and has served in Iraq, Afghanistan, East Timor, and in disaster relief operations, and as a legal advisor to the ADF domestic counter-terrorism operations. So Lauren, we really value your input here, along with another colleague and good friend, Brett Sangster, who has also served at a high level with our ADF and is now a defence partner at McCulloch Robertson Lawyers. Brett, I also know through the fantastic not-for-profit Wandering Warriors. He's the chair of that important foundation that supports our transitioning military and defence forces. So Brett has national reach, I should say, and leads a bespoke defence and national security practice group at the firm, with a sharp focus on supporting ADF capability and a flourishing sovereign defence industry through the provision of timely and pragmatic advice and around national outcomes. So we're drawing on his 23 years of experience in government and private enterprise throughout his career, as well as a business strategist in defence and national security. As I mentioned, he has also served as an Army legal officer and has participated in numerous offshore deployments in the advancement of strategic military objectives, both in war and humanitarian. For his efforts, he was awarded an ADF commendation in 2011. So we welcome you as well, Brett. I think that covers everyone. Many thanks for your time. The first panel we'll be working with is on greenwashing. So such a topical issue. I know we're reading about it across different fields, from law to marketing to economics, all across the media. We've got the Santos case, which is a world first test case here in Australia that hopefully we'll hear a bit about today as well. We have, in the context of ESG reporting, scrutiny around the potential to greenwash, and a need to understand hard metrics around reporting and justification of greenwashing claims. So first up, Barbara, I understand we're welcoming you.
Thank you, Sarah, for your kind introduction. I will share my slides. Just bear with me. Hope it's working. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Excellent, thank you. So good afternoon to everybody. I have, as everybody else, only seven minutes, so I will try to be as quick and as brief as possible. So what I want to do in my short presentation is to provide you with kind of a general legal introduction to greenwashing. And so first of all, what is greenwashing? It's a form of misleading. More specifically, it involves various forms of false environmental claims. And when it comes to intention, it can be anything from mistakes, non-intentional, to small exaggeration, to deliberate lies. We usually find greenwashing, so these claims would be in advertising, logos, description of products, services. Where we probably had most of the discussion on greenwashing is in connection with financial markets, so financial products and services. And I know that Ilona will discuss in more details the financial markets, financial products, ISEC work. So I will leave that. But what I want to do is to provide you with a little bit of roots or the origin of the discussion, why we are talking about greenwashing, talk very briefly about the EU, not only because I'm originally from EU, but European Union is kind of leading in certain way this debate and the policy changes when it comes to greenwashing. And then I'm going to finish with just briefly with Australia and the ACCC work in this area. So why we've been talking about greenwashing? So really we need to look into two important documents of United Nations. So United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, which was signed, of course, in Paris at the end of 2015. In the same year, United Nations also introduced 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is kind of broader. The Paris Agreement really focuses on climate change, the environmental protection, while the agenda takes much broader approach when it comes to sustainable development. And on those bases, the European Union introduced its European Green Deal in 2020. The European Green Deal has 50 policy initiatives with the overreaching aim to make the European Union climate neutral by 2050. And in these policy initiatives, there are several things, and certain things are directly linked to greenwashing. There are things also directly related to financial markets. So for instance, EU requires financial markets to report on sustainability. The initiatives start to become part of, or on those basis of initiatives, the European Union started to introduce certain rules, if you want. It's a bit complex and complicated when it comes to European Union law, what kind of rules are there and so on. But when it comes to greenwashing, really what's important is the area of unfair competition law and consumer law. So the European Union has Consumer Rights Directive and also Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. This year, based on the European Green Deal, it introduced amendment. It hasn't been for both directives, so the directives haven't been amended yet, but most likely that's going to happen. So that has been introduced at the end of this year. And specifically, the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive has some direct changes, or the amendment has direct changes for when it comes to greenwashing. So thinking about different jurisdictions, so common law countries here in Australia, New Zealand, UK, USA, we kind of recognize or differentiate between competition law and consumer law. You know, in Australia, it's Australian Competition and Consumer Act, where we have both consumer law and competition law. While in continental European systems, there are three areas of law. So there is consumer law, there is competition law, and unfair competition law. And unfair competition law is the area of law which deals with misleading and deceptive conduct. And that's the area of law which directly, or in general terms, covers greenwashing. As we know, greenwashing is a form of misleading. So unfair competition law comes under consumer law in Australia, in other common law countries. So this amendment, the proposal of an amendment, for instance, when it comes to Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, it includes direct provisions directly prohibiting various forms of greenwashing. For instance, if it becomes part of the directive, for instance, we will see that vague terminology about environmental friendly product services, so any vague terminology about environment and environmental claims will be prohibited directly. So in Australia, we have consumer law, which deals with misleading and deceptive conduct. We have as a general section, section 18, which generally prohibits misleading or deceptive conduct. And then there's an area of Australian consumer law, which has a list of, let's say, specific prohibitions. And I just kind of put on this slide a few of them and highlighted to which I would say would be directly relevant for greenwashing. So like the EU directive, there is a general prohibition and in general terms prohibition, which is relevant to greenwashing. But in the EU, it's going to have also the European Union directive. It's also going to have a specific prohibition on greenwashing. So what about the discussion in this area of law, so competition and consumer law? So the ACCC has been talking about greenwashing this year, specifically, so in certain events, workshops, but also at the end of this year, at the beginning of October 2022, the ACCC launched 2 internet sweeps to identify online greenwashing. And it already said that the findings from these sweeps will be then used for the compliance and enforcement priorities for next year. So there's definitely going to be more discussion. We haven't amended consumer law yet. Perhaps it's going to happen in the future, but there will be more discussion, and the ACCC is definitely directly looking into greenwashing and will be looking into greenwashing in the future. So that's all from me. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Barbara. And I think, I mean, that's really interesting just to get that update of the laws and possible changes ahead. I mean, I've got so many questions out of that, but we might hold the questions till the end of the panel. So I think Ilona was presenting next.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'll just share my screen as well. Hopefully everyone can see that now.
Yes, we can. Thanks, Ilona.
Okay, fantastic. So I was going to pick up where Barbara left off. I'll just make sure that this is moving forward. So we've heard about what greenwashing is and also the context under the Australian consumer law. You also have within the Australian legal system under both the Corporations Law and the ASIC Act, equivalent provisions with respect to misleading and deceptive conduct, and also provisions which create causes of action if people make representations about a future matter where they haven't got reasonable grounds for making that representation. And then that also becomes something that is taken to be misleading. So one of the areas of particular focus for the Corporations Law has been on claims around the ability to meet future net zero targets and the processes of getting to those targets, which is the subject of the Santos claim. There are also within the mix the broader sort of context around how this influences the roles and responsibilities of directors who have duties under the Corporations Law to act with care and diligence when exercising their powers and to act in good faith and for a proper purpose in the best interests of the company. So, this is an issue that's absolutely right, not only, at an executive level, but also in the boardroom in terms of consideration of claims that are being made about products and services and ambitions and intentions. So Barbara's already mentioned the ACCC's sort of spotlight and focus on misleading claims, and that being a top priority for the current financial year. Similarly, ASIC has also identified greenwashing as a priority. And so this is a front and centre in terms of the current strategic and corporate plan for ASIC as well. Overseas, Barbara has mentioned the position in the EU, but the US are also looking very closely at this through the Security Exchange Commission, the SEC, and indeed they have already initiated a couple of investigations, including into companies and groups like the Goldman Sachs Group with respect to their claims about their assets under management and their alignment with ESG standards. There's a raft of cases that have been run and are underway at the moment. Greenwashing litigation is not necessarily new. We've got cases stretching back to the mid-2000s, particularly looking at claims with respect to energy, and indeed in 2019, the ACCC brought proceedings against Volkswagen with respect to their diesel emission standards. But the cases that have really got the spotlight in Australia over the last sort of 12 months or so have been the proceedings that have been initiated not by a regulator, but by a stakeholder group, the Australia Centre for Corporate Responsibility, bringing proceedings around potential misleading misrepresentations in Santos's annual report, in particular about their claims around natural gas being a clean fuel and their ability to reach net zero emissions, in particular through the use of processes like carbon capture and storage. So that case is underway at the moment. We haven't got to a full hearing yet, but sort of certainly a case to watch. In another really interesting case, which feeds into the context of greenwashing, is the action brought against the Commonwealth Bank by shareholders who have started with a books and records claim to actually look at how they can get access to information about how the bank has been financing certain projects. And it's sort of viewed that this books and records case might be a precursor to a subsequent claim with respect to misleading and deceptive conduct, subject to what those books and records sort of bring to light vis-a-vis the bank's policies about their investments. But most recently, the ASIC has had its first enforcement action in this space, and that was against a company called Tulu Energy. And that company had claimed that their electricity would be carbon neutral, that they were generating electricity from solar power, and that their gas to power projects would be low emissions. ASIC investigated that from a greenwashing perspective, found them in contravention of the ASIC Act, and have issued penalties amounting to just over $50,000. So we have had quite a bit of litigation action in respect of greenwashing recently, which again brings it front and centre to directors. Similarly, in the overseas, quite a few different cases which we can talk to in the discussion. What I wanted to just sort of focus on just in the last minute or two that I've got is, what is ASIC doing in terms of providing guidance to companies in terms of managing the risks of greenwashing. And earlier this year, ASIC produced an information sheet, which is largely directed at the financial services sector, but is also equally applicable to any company that's thinking about how it's making statements in respect of sustainability-linked products. The information sheet sort of sets out 9 questions which are designed to facilitate both truth and promotion and clarity in communication. And if you just sort of look through the types of questions that come to mind when thinking about this, sort of firstly, is the product true to label? Is the terminology that's being used vague, or is it unsubstantiated? So you've got to sort of avoid those broad types of, socially responsible or ethical or impact claims. And are the headline claims, the first ones that people looking at a product will see, are they potentially misleading? The questions then go on to the process of, what are you doing to explain how the sustainability factors that have been incorporated into your investment decisions and stewardship activities? Can you essentially explain the methodology, the policy informing the considerations, and how these have been assessed by the company? Then are you explaining investment screening criteria, and how do you interact with potentially different indices that are linked to measuring sustainability? And then the last couple of questions go to the measurement and the grounds for the stated sustainability targets. So if you're using metrics, have you explained them? What are the sources of these metrics? Where's the data coming from? Are there limitations? Do you have reasonable grounds for those targets? And can you explain how these will be measured and achieved? And is it easy for investors to locate and access information? So these are the sorts of questions that ASIC is sort of prompting people to think about when making sustainability related claims. So in summary, to avoid and reduce the risks, first thing is to, watch out for red flags around unsubstantiated corporate goals, be very careful about forward-looking statements, and also, be, very careful about the labeling in terms of environmentally friendly, sustainability, or ethical. So ultimately, what I think we will see is a continued growth in frequency in terms of actions taken by regulators, both here and overseas, and also a spotlight and focus continuing from investors. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Ilona. That's very valuable, and particularly, your obviously close involvement and oversight of some of these key cases. There's a lot of learnings there for directors and governance in particular. So we'll hold the questions, as I said, to the end. I know we're getting a few through right now, and we'll hand it over to the accounting side. Kath, can we hand it over to you next?
Certainly. I'll just attempt to share my screen.
Sure. Yes, that's working.
Is that working? Okay. So I've got a slightly different perspective as a financial accountant, so hopefully it will dovetail quite well. The term greenwashing has been used in accounting since, say, the mid-1980s. And it comes from a very fragmented and disparate multidisciplinary approach. And one of the main problems we've had is casting too narrow a net when we try to define greenwashing. So I think,
Kathleen, sorry,
yeah.
Could you just put it on presentation mode? It's quite difficult to.
It is on presentation mode in mine, so I'll try and share the right screen.
Okay, thank you.
Apologies. Thank you for letting me know. Is that better?
That's better. Yeah, thanks, Kath.
All right. No, right. So we're back to this. So I would say that when we look at greenwashing, it's really a broad umbrella term that covers a variety of modes of misleading communication. It doesn't just cover the disclosure of information. It can be something like this Mazda CX-5 ad that I can remember seeing when I was a little bit younger. What they've done here is clearly there's no information, but they've associated the new Sky Active technology with the Dr. Zeus Lorax who saved the tree, and they've claimed that it's a truffle tree friendly technology. So what they've done is they've appropriated an image from a popular children's fiction book that carries some certain positive connotations. So it is really quite a broad phenomena we're discussing. So what is greenwashing? It can occur at a corporate, a company level, or a product level. And as an accountant, I'm interested in the company level greenwashing. We talk about manipulation of disclosure as one type. So in economics, we talk about cheap talk, so unsubstantiated, non-specific, or we talk about boilerplate, which is generic, so it goes from one firm to another. Now, I've taken this example from an ASX 200 listed company. It is completely de-identified. So what they do is they have a lot of cheap talk. They've refreshed, they continue to monitor, they actively manage, and they find new ways. But that doesn't really tell us a great deal about what they're doing. The second type is selective disclosure. So companies can omit particular details, or they can overemphasize the positive and forget about the negative. Another de-identified example from the ASX 200. In this case, it's a graph of the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the company has omitted to tell you if it's scope 1 or scope 2 or even scope 3. And this sort of shows that types of greenwashing can overlay. So not only have they had omission, but they've also manipulated the disclosure. Because if you look at it carefully, they've got the business as usual, which is monotonically increasing. They've got their 2015 target, and their actual emissions aren't actually very healthy when you look at the fact that they're not decreasing, they're actually increasing. So why do companies engage in greenwashing? Well, we have Akerlof's theory of the market for lemons. So there's information asymmetry between the managers and the investors. And the investors don't know if they're dealing with a lemon or if they're dealing with a Lamborghini. And so they require a premium. So if you're a performer who's doing quite well, that is the Lamborghini, you undertake additional voluntary disclosure to signal, hey, we're actually quite valuable, we're doing the right thing. So they have hard, verifiable disclosures that are very difficult to mimic. The poor performer, the lemon, will try and engage in greenwashing. They attempt to mimic the disclosures of the high performer, but they can't. So it's unverifiable and quite soft. How is it possible in an accounting context? So if I give you an example, NGERS, so that's been in operation for quite some time in Australia. It mandates the disclosure of Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions. So what you find is companies have quite related voluntary disclosures that relate directly to the NGERS, and then they go even further and have additional climate-related disclosures that go beyond emissions. The further away you get from the regulated disclosure, the less structured the voluntary disclosures, therefore the more opportunity for greenwash. So I thought I'd finish with 3 areas that I predict we need to be watching in the future in an accounting context. The first is selective disclosure. So this is a project I'm currently involved with the AASB, the Australian Accounting Standards Board. And we've looked at environmental, in particular climate-related disclosure that's occurred within the ASX 200 environmentally sensitive sectors from 2017 to 2020. So what we found is that if you look at energy consumption, 45% of companies are not only disclosing, but they're also assuring immaterial information. So it's not particularly relevant to assessing their performance. Similarly, with water consumption, 40% are reporting on water consumption and are getting it assured, and Scope 1, 30%. When it's immaterial. So that's a good way of appearing to be making climate change a priority, but you're actually not. The second area that I think is going to be really interesting is the disclosure of opportunities. So the TCFD, the task force that has looked at climate-related financial disclosures, recommends not only disclosure on risks, but also on opportunities. So another way of describing these opportunities is it's avoided emissions using your product or service, so the Scope 4. To give you an example of the types of claims, this is taken from the CDP submission of Orica. And I'm not saying Orica has done anything wrong, this is just an example. They claim that the mining operations can reduce energy use and greenhouse gas emissions since the chemical energy supplied by Orica is 25 times more efficient at breaking rock. And lastly, in the last few seconds that I've got, reporting of strategic commitments by companies. So as companies transition to a low carbon economy, they're going to have to explain their transition pathway. And if you look at the IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standards, number 2 on climate-related disclosures that is currently being discussed in Australia as well as Europe, there's quite a significant amount of disclosure required on this. So we've touched on Santos. So in particular, some of the disclosures made by Santos in its 2021 climate change report, completely voluntary disclosure, are being challenged, particularly around the carbon storage and capture, as well as the benefits of blue hydrogen. So very interesting times in financial accounting. Thank you.
Yeah, that was fascinating, Kath, and another angle to this burgeoning issue for governance and for ethics. And for trust, I guess, so it covers all 3 of our pillars in our alliance. So I might put it out to the audience. Do we have any questions from those online? Not at the moment. I know Shannon's been capturing some of the chat as well, but I would have just a quick couple of ones before we go to our next panel, if that's okay. So one is when we're, and it could be from any of you actually, this one, but how do supply chain and the entire value chain come into this? Do we now need to, as an organisation, scrutinise their claims as well? Because a lot of their claims, you know, I suppose are bundled up in what might be our claims. So is this part of the new regime, would you say, going forward?
I can answer from an accounting perspective and then hand it over to the lawyers. So one of the proposals in the IFRS S2 is that Scope 3 emissions are disclosed.
Right.
And so therefore the companies are now looking very carefully at what's happening in their supply chain. So some of the larger companies that already have systems in place have been capturing this data for a while. But the issue that they have, and is we've been talking to some assurers and directors, it's plus or minus 30 or 20%. So you've got a board of directors having to have this information go out, and they're very, very nervous about what's going to happen. So that's the accounting perspective.
I think from a legal perspective, certainly we're starting to see companies disclose Scope 3, and that's, as Kath has said, coming through with the standards. But there is a lot of nervousness about being able to make those commitments to Scope 3, and in particular, sort of looking at what that will involve in the context of science-based targets as well. So certainly in the climate change space, we are starting to see that look through to value chain emissions. I think there are other areas in the context of greenwashing more broadly where we may start to see this as well, but more in the context of you know, human rights related disclosures and ethics and modern slavery within supply chains. You know, so ethically sourced cotton or you know, other types of products that are you know, free of child labor or slavery. So it'll be interesting to see what types of approaches are taken with regard to those non-greenhouse claims as well.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's a really complex issue. You sort of wonder if we need a whole new subcommittee on boards advising and reporting just on this. Shannon, I think we've got some questions.
Sorry, just wanted to say that from what's, for instance, happening in the EU, they're absolutely clear that not checking whether, you know, your supplier provided you with the right information is not an excuse. So they blanketly said that's not an excuse. Of course, taking into consideration the general provision on misleading and deceptive conduct. Even from Australian point of view, it doesn't necessarily should be an excuse that you didn't check. We can associate that with, for instance, my product was made in Australia. Not checking your suppliers is not an excuse. So legally, EU definitely absolutely clear it's not an excuse. And I would say even in Australia, I mean, perhaps potentially shouldn't be an excuse.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Barbara. And it's interesting, isn't it? It's like GDPR, privacy laws, Europe's been the high watermark that maybe Australia will slowly adopt to that level, it looks like. So thank you for that. I think we've got time for one more question, Shannon, from the chat.
Sure. Leanne was wondering, you know, what guidance could be given towards making defensible claims when the data is largely qualitative rather than hard quantitative scoring, you know, aka the human rights, child labor.
Yeah, I think one of the things to come back to always is you know, when making statements or when boards are signing off on reports that have claims in respect of be it climate or other aspects of sustainability, it comes back down to that question of you know, whether there is a reasonable basis for the statements and that the board has interrogated that. So when we work with directors, we very much ask them to substantiate everything that they are doing in terms of making claims to the extent that they can and satisfying themselves that they have reasonable grounds with respect to the claims that are being made.
Thanks, Ilona. Yeah, look, there's so many great questions here too, but I am conscious of time because we've got our second panel. You know, there are things like double counting in the reporting is a bit of an issue, but I think, Kath, you've dealt with that in your 3 final recommendations, really, haven't you? That, you know, that could in fact happen if disclosures aren't full and fully transparent. There's also questions around that intersection between, say, the consumer, the marketing perspective, which we're all very used to, where there's a bit of puffery in claims in marketing as a competitive positioning. That looks like that's out the window now as far as claiming to be green goes. What we're hearing today is you have to be very specific, not vague at all. But I guess that makes it a very fine line to tread, because if you go out as a disclosure to the market, for instance, or in your reporting about something that is a specific number, for instance, you're bound to it. So very, very tricky business, isn't it? And to Leanne's point, the qualitative coming in there, that is very tricky to measure, but it's great advice and great insight as to what's ahead and current practices. So thank you very much to this panel. We appreciate your time and insights. And please feel free, I imagine, to contact the panel following this as well if you've got further questions, or through us at TIGA. So thank you very much. So I'll give you a little clap. So we're now on to our second panel on defence export controls. So Lauren, I've already introduced you. Can I hand that over to you to kick off on this important discussion next?
Thanks very much. And I'm just going to follow the trend and share my screen. So hopefully you can all see that now, yes, and can all hear me, because I've adjusted my microphone and whatnot, and that always is traumatic in the middle of a presentation. Thanks for inviting me to speak today, and it was great to actually catch up again with Brett. It's been a few years between us actually working together, so it was nice to have that opportunity to reconnect. But it did remind me that there's not a lot of people actually who are deep in this area, but it is an area that touches on quite a breadth of different industries, and increasingly so with the way that technology is developing, which is really what I want to talk about today in my 5 to 7 minutes, which is really how do we look at this regime and the challenges of assurance and governance in this area when we're dealing with quite novel situations with the emerging and disruptive technologies. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking from. So I'm coming from Wangara country, and I'd like to acknowledge the elders past and present, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples in our audience today. So as briefly mentioned, I come from the Law and the Future of War program at the UQ Law School, and we focus on researching some of the policy and legal international law issues associated with emerging and disruptive technologies, which is really the angle I would like to be covering today in terms of Australia's export control regime, which I hope will set up nicely for Brett to then talk about his experience as a practitioner, which is of course the other side of this coin, which is how do we implement these political and strategic objectives to try and prevent equipment and military software knowledge services getting into the wrong hands, or of course being used by the wrong people, or just even being in the wrong place. Now I purposely chose a very bland picture there with a folder on the wall, because a lot of this is actually very process driven in how this system works. And again, I'll leave Brett to talk about the trials and tribulations of doing this, but it's important to note that the requirement to actually create this kind of a system that applies across the export, re-export and transfer of these kinds of commodities, technologies, softwares and services is very process driven, because it can't be conducted by bureaucrats. There isn't the workforce in government to keep a close eye on how these export controls work. So it is very process driven and it is very slow. We operate under a list-based approach, which instead of having generic criteria specifies the kinds of technologies, services and softwares that are prevented from being exported or only allowed to be exported with permissions or licenses. And we're doing that on the basis that we're incorporating specific international legal obligations into our domestic legislation, which also brings up some challenges in terms of the agility of the system and the strength of the system in terms of its speed to respond to emerging and disruptive technology. Emerging and disruptive technologies themselves cause a number of challenges, mostly because of the nature of the technology being quite porous. It's very capable of being sent via the internet as far as plans are concerned. You might have heard of some new trends in 3D printing where people are printing weapons, for example, where there's just small operative parts that need to be added to those kinds of printed objects. So control is more difficult than it had been in the past, where the kinds of technologies that were being transferred were really those weapons of mass destruction focused elements. And really it was a Cold War regime where it was focused on big ticket military items being taken offshore or being used by people we didn't want them to use. Whereas now the proliferation of these simple technologies, the dual use nature of technologies and the commercial use of products to be implemented into military hardware is causing some challenges. So just as an example as well, the increasing availability of commercially available product to augment military capability is being played out in the Ukraine conflict at the moment. There's quite a lot of reporting about microchips avoiding sanctions regimes and avoiding export control regimes. And in the past, we've relied heavily on the fact that if we can control these things by key suppliers, states won't be using lesser products or won't be creating their own products to try and get around the system. But what we are seeing is that cheap alternatives are being used because near enough is good enough in terms of the people that are using these kinds of capabilities. And the Russian example is the precedent one. They're using these chips in their missiles with a 66% failure rate, knowing that those chips are substandard, but they don't really care about the impact of the legal impact of them being used and not landing or striking where they're intended to strike in the first instance. So there needs to be a change to the paradigm in our approach to how we're actually trying to control these technologies, because the way that what we were trying to control has changed, and the way that the things we were trying to control are being now used has also changed. So to sort of step back a little bit as well, it's useful to think about the origins of the system. And the system that we operate in Australia, as I said, is largely list-based because it's focused on these technologies, or it's focused on controlling the four key agreements that you can see on the screen. So nuclear equipment, pretty obvious and relatively simple to control. The same as chemical and biological agents, because it's quite obvious if people are taking the sorts of things that they need to try and create these items for misuse or for no good. The missile technology control regime starts to get us into that dual use area where we're starting to get a bit more technologically advanced in how we're approaching export control systems, and the same with the Wassenaar arrangement, which is talking about conventional military items. But the difference with these regimes to what we need to be thinking about for the future, or the challenge, is that these are all talking about dual use items, or trying to regulate dual use items where there is an inherent military use for the capability that we're dealing with. Now that could be quite subjective, but also what we're finding is that it doesn't take much to adjust broad range technology for military use. So that inherent nature of what might or might not be used for military use is expanding. It's becoming increasingly difficult to understand what may or may not be captured, or what really should or shouldn't be captured by these regimes, because the other side of this regulatory balance is talking about not stifling innovation and supporting the economy, noting that a lot of these emerging and disruptive technologies are key to the Australian government's economic development plans. A large number of risks and opportunities come out from where we sit at the moment in terms of export controls. We are sitting in the middle of a 3 to 4 year window of review of the legislative process. So we are faced with an opportunity and also a risk if we don't make some substantial changes to how we approach the system. But we do have an opportunity to try and update how the system itself is being operated so that it can be more flexible to support business, but also that it can be more flexible to capture those kinds of items that we don't want to be taken offshore with country-specific kinds of regulation as compared to the previous country-agnostic export control regime. And equally, the human rights compliance component hasn't been built into the regime very well in the past, and I think that's something that we have an opportunity to address in this current legislative review. There are a number of risks as well with how we approach the system, and I think most of those risks really relate to how industry engages with the process and the system, which is why I leave it there. And I think that probably opens the window for Brett to take the mantle to talk about the system in a little bit more detail. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Lauren. And that was a terrific presentation. No one will be surprised when I say that Lauren was the high performer in the Australian Army. And I get the pleasure to follow on. But look, I'm going to buck the trend and just make my my presentation a little bit more conversational. And I don't have slides. And perhaps at this time of day, that might be a relief. Look, Lauren's done a great job in setting out the complexities of the framework. If we layer on the export control framework and the various stakeholders in export controls, we also need to consider from a business perspective, and Lauren also talked about the growth of this as an industry, the import controls as well. And lots of those are actually almost in conflict with each other because we're again, not surprisingly, talking about state versus federal legislation, and they don't always marry up. So when we're looking at it from a business perspective, we've got to consider all of these different regimes, all of these different permits in terms of export and in many instances imports as well. Lauren talked about the growth of this as an industry. As a practitioner in this area, we're seeing more and more businesses are reaching out for assistance with this because of the complexity, and really just, as Lauren said, it's really process driven, and it's not always immediately apparent on how to follow. The bouncing ball is not necessarily in a linear fashion. Of course, there's the defence generational expenditure, and that's, in 2016 we came out and said there's $200 billion of money to spend. Since then, that's been revised to $270 billion of committed capital. What that has created, and of course now we have another defence strategic review underway, but what that has created is a real girth of industry focused very much in the defence sector, but then you layer on that dual use products that are captured under the Defence Strategic Goods list, or indeed if they're captured anyway, if they have an inherent military use. So we're talking about a large body of businesses, Australian businesses that are captured. And I'd like to talk quickly about a bit of a case study to to illustrate really the complexity. But before I do, it's not just the defence, it's the capital expenditure in the Australian budget, but it's also policy settings such as the Defence Industry Capability Plan, which guides businesses around where the priorities are in the spending, around cyber, around maritime domains or sectors. And again, this has created an enormous, a burgeoning sector of businesses purely within this defence market. Foreign policy settings, we've now got the AUKUS setting, which is Australia, UK and US. It kicked off really around the submarine program, but it's now extended into cyber, and we get to see how that will become a coherent treaty. But it's good news probably for Australian businesses, particularly as they scale into the US, into the UK and Europe. Importantly, though, as Lauren touched, then that brings other complexities around on-selling from the US, or indeed US companies buying into Australian companies and bringing the ITAR regime into play as well. Recent conflicts, we've got the Ukraine conflict, and that's obviously heightened this interest of defence exports, particularly around the military hardware, and it's being traded right around the world at the moment. And of course, increasingly contested Indo-Pacific region is a good reason why in Australia we need to ensure, as corporate good citizens, no matter what government policies in play, we need to ensure that where we can, we're complying with good corporate citizen controls. If I can then just talk about a case study, and I'll try and go on a no names basis, but to give you a dual use case study of a business that we've assisted. It's a mining services business. They have no general other military application other than they have a product that is mining technology, and associated with that or incidental to that is mining or software applications. So to paint the picture of this business, they're headquartered in Australia, but they have offices right around the world and in all of the various continents, and importantly, places such as South America and Africa and in Asia as well. So that brings into our concerns or DFAT's concerns around sanctions and what countries that may be on the sanctions list there. They have multiple entities across their business, and that's been from a series of years of corporate activity, M&A and the like. So some of those entities have been proactive and they have permits in place, albeit they have expired because they're not forever. They have life type of life for them. And also the other issue with permits is they tend to be very narrow in there, or they can be very narrow. And of course, businesses, they flex, they change direction, and the permits don't necessarily keep up with the pace of the business. But back to this business, it has multiple mining products with dual use application. And those products also have a very long lifespan. So we have a business that has exported over many years these products that also have dual use applications. So they're brilliant in mining, but they also can be used in accuracy in defence systems as well. They have no way then of when they have exported these products through their various businesses out into globally, where those products have landed. They don't know how long their life has been. And so they've got no real way of tracking those. And the only way they can do it is really through contractual obligations. And of course, not everyone complies with those. And then it brings a whole compliance requirement as well, which is very, very onerous on business. So in this case, we had a product that was maybe on the DSGL. If not, it was definitely a non-controlled product with a military application. And we also had the issue or the concern around the product being sent to sanctioned nations. So that gives you, hopefully that sort of paints a little bit of the way of the complexity of this regime. And then of course, we layer on the import controls and the state regulations and laws over top of that as well. So some real practical examples in terms of managing this for our clients. We really just implement a three-phase client strategy. We try and break it down. It's something that is very complex into something process-driven. It's a little bit easier and simpler to apply. We advise to screen our product. Is it on the DSGL list? Does it have military use? If so, is it planned to be exported to a sanctioned nation or not? Or can we guarantee that it's not? The second phase of our compliance strategy is the vetting phase. So we vet the end customer and we vet the end site as to where it's going to be. And then finally, the third phase of our compliance regime is authorization. So we then set about seeking out authorizations from the relevant authority, be that defence or be it DFAT. Quickly, so you'll see, just hopefully painting from that illustration, some of the commercial challenges for industry is the sheer volume of the law and policy for export and import. The timeliness of our authorization regime through DECO, the Defence Export Control Office, and other government agencies in terms of them getting their authorizations back to industry in a timely fashion is out of sequence. So as you'd appreciate, business moves very quickly. Authorizations, by the sheer volume, probably do not. And I mentioned earlier, keeping permits up to date and broad enough to be relevant for the business operations or the operations of a global business. Cost and time associated with compliance, even just maintaining the register for that business that I mentioned a moment ago. Their register there's a full-time compliance risk manager looking at this, and that person can't keep up with the register. And then our practical advice in terms of managing, aside from the proactive side of the compliance strategy, we seek authority to export, but we don't expect a timely answer. We engage with DECO and DFAT or the relevant agency very early or as early as possible. And if we think we're in breach, we will get our act together. We'll get all of our evidence together, and then we'll seek disclosure to those agencies. Of course, on the back of those, there are penalties, but in my experience, provided you're proactive, you're honest, and you implement risk management strategies for the future, then I've found that those agencies to be very willing to work with business to ensure, because really ultimately it's all about ensuring that our export controls are managed. It's not so much about penalties.
Great. Thank you, Brett. This is just a fascinating two fantastic panels on really, really interesting topics where I feel we've only had time to examine quite superficially, but thanks to the expertise on both panels, we've got a sufficient depth of both your experience, some cases, the legislative and regulatory overview and vision going forward, the compliance requirements, and some practical recommendations as well for businesses out there. So look, I think it's been fascinating. We'll probably have time for one question. Does anyone have a question who is still online? Not at the moment. I probably just had one, and Brett, or either of you actually, Lauren or Brett, where do you think it's headed? I mean, if we're in, one of these dual purpose businesses potentially, like the mining industry you've mentioned that seems to be captured, or the technology industry, how can we position to sort of stay ahead of the increasing compliance that will happen in the current socio-political environment? Are there any other active steps you think we should make other than those three you came up with, Brett or Lauren?
So I think Lauren and I talked about this during the week, and I think the issue is probably education of industry to make sure. But a lot of businesses that I deal with don't actually understand there's a regime in place at all. So a lot of them are small, medium enterprises. So there's an education piece and getting that across, and that's DECO. And DECO have done, Defence Export Control Office have done a pretty good job in trying to get that paraphernalia out, although I think it's been removed at the moment because it's under review. The other issue is, I think there's a funding issue for Export Control Office in keeping up with it. But I was just looking through the stats, and this year they've had 2,600 applications, and they've finalised, or they claim to have finalised 2,000. Which equates to about $5 to $6 billion worth of export. So that's a big workload for a small. And I think Lauren, we were saying earlier, there's one lawyer in that team to assist with some of the curly questions. So, sorry, Lauren.
That's a fascinating statistic, and Lauren, combined with that one lawyer, that's just crazy, and it's only expanding. Lauren, did you have something to add before we?
The only quick thing I would say is I think petitioning to reduce the bureaucracy for our standing trade partners. So AUKUS is a really great opportunity for us to try and reduce red tape with at least the UK and the US.
That's good advice, actually, isn't it? Because there is a lot of it by the sounds of it. So yeah, if we can streamline the hearings, they are important. The compliance is needed. There's no question from a policy angle. But that would really help practically. So thank you. Look, I'd like to just re-emphasize, thank you so much for everyone for your time on both panels. Fascinating topics. I think a lot of the researchers from the Trust Ethics and Governance Alliance are inspired to embark on further conversations and research. and hopefully those from industry who are in the audience and our partners will be inspired to hear more from TIGA and our partners as well in the future. So again, thanks for your time, everyone who's joined us. I do encourage you to follow TIGA, the Trust, Ethics and Governance Alliance, on the LinkedIn. That's probably the best way to find us, or to contact myself, Sarah Kelly at UQ, or my co-leader of this setup, Professor Nicole Gillespie. And we look forward to hearing from you. So thanks very much and have a good evening, everyone.